Hello, America, and welcome back to America's favorite game show, Saint or Sinner. Here's your host, the Dockery Docket. Wow, thank you so much for that. Seriously, thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Saint or Sinner. This episode is very special, and it is still Saint or Sinner, but this time it is Statue Edition. Ooh. So, for this, I will give you a statue with a short description, and you will guess if they are a saint or a sinner, and if they need to be torn down. The contestants are all the same because I am lazy. Let's get right into it with our very first statue. George Washington. He was known as the founder of our country, as he was our very first president. And he has written and said many times that he does not like slavery. However, he was a slave owner on his Virginia plantation. He was also known for beating the British in the Revolutionary War. So, is George Washington a saint or a sinner? Sarah. Oh yes, Docket, thank you so much for having me. I will say sinner, and we also need to tear down everything that is associated with him. That is correct. You get a point. Next up, we have Thomas Jefferson. He was the writer of the Declaration of Independence, where his ideas of all men are created equal was a staple of America's founding principles. However, he did own slaves and was known for having many children with slaves. So, is Thomas Jefferson a saint or a sinner? Justin. Sinner, and we should tear down his statue. That is correct. And now we have our very last statue. I apologize once again. I know these shows are so exciting, but we are down to our very last statue. And this statue is the Statue of Liberty, which was given to us as a gift by the French and was a beacon for new immigrants that were coming into our country. So, is the Statue of Liberty a saint or a sinner? Justin, again. Well, we should just wait a few months and, then we'll probably find out that there's something historically wrong with the statue, and then we'll demand to take it down. Wow, that answer is not correct, and the answer was saint. However, I do believe that you are right, so you will get a half point for that. So, Justin, that makes you our winner for this episode. Congratulations. Well, that is all the time that we have for today, so until next time, remember, it is never too young to erase history, and make sure to join us on the next episode of Saint or Sinner. Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Kyle Dockery with the Dockery Docket. We are here with our very 31st episode of the Dockery Docket. I'm excited to be here, and I hope that you are excited to be here as well. So, a lot of crazy stuff is going on in the entire world right now, and this has pertained to sort of a little bit to different statues that have been put up all over the United States, and many people are calling for them to be taken down. So, 2 years ago, Donald Trump said one of the most craziest, most bizarre things that any president in American history has ever said. When talking about Robert E. Lee and the taking down of his statue, a reporter told Trump that George Washington and Robert E. Lee are not the same. And this is a very true statement, as one was the founder of our country, and the other one tried to completely destroy America and split it in two. But we will talk about that later. Anyway, Trump said that George Washington was a slave owner. So then Donald Trump said, will George Washington lose his status? Are we going to take down statues of George Washington? I'm paraphrasing this because, Donald Trump's talking to a reporter, so there's a lot of back and forth. Trump then moved on to talk about Thomas Jefferson, as he said, how about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? You like him? Okay, good. Are we going to take down the statue of him? Because he was a major slave owner. Now, are we going to take down his statue? So This statement that Donald Trump said about tearing down the statues of Thomas Jefferson, tearing down the statues of George Washington, was just bizarre by the president, because there was no possible way in our history that we, the American people, would decide to take down a statue of our founding fathers. It was just absurd. The people who wrote our Declaration of Independence birthed the nation from nothing into the country that it is today. There would never be a day where a group of people whose whole goal in mind was to frame the past of America as 100% founded on racism, and not the radical idea of that time that all men were created equal. At this time 2 years ago, this is what the media was thinking. They were thinking that Trump was pointing to extremes, and it was not possible that people would do this. Well, knock knock, they are here. This mob that we talked about last week is deciding that it is their time to change the history and destroy the history that we have created in this country. So the mob decided first to attack the very third president of the United States, as in Portland, Oregon on Sunday, a Thomas Jefferson statue was found on the sidewalk. According to KATU, the statue is mostly still intact, but the words slave owner were sprayed on its base. It wasn't only in Oregon where the calls to remove Thomas Jefferson's statue was made, as in New York, according to the New York Post, a group of Big Apple local elected officials on Thursday formally asked Mayor Bill de Blasio to remove the statue of Thomas Jefferson from City Hall. They cite that he was a racist, and a councilperson said that they believe that the New York City Council should neither ignore nor glorify this dark side of American history. While yes, it is true that Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner, this is not the reason that we have a statue of him up in different places around the country. The reason that we have a statue up is because he wrote one of the greatest political documents of all time, the Declaration of Independence. In this document came the most famous line, probably in American history ever, that all men are created equal. And yes, it took a long time to fulfill that promise, but guess what? We did it. The idea that all men are created equal was a radical idea at the time, as many nations, even the nation that was writing the document, was in possession of slaves. Jefferson, however, believed in a society where people could be free to live together in peace. And as Jefferson grew up in a society where slavery was a normality, which that doesn't make slavery okay, even though it was normal in his time, he started to see what slavery really was. Terrible. He believed that slavery presented the greatest threat to the survival of the new American nation, which it almost did with the Civil War, which we'll talk about later. Jefferson also thought that slavery was contrary to the laws of nature, which decrees that everyone has a right to personal liberty. These views were radical in the world, where unfree labor was the norm. All over the entire world at this time, there were people who were enslaving other people. Doesn't make it right, but that's what was happening in the world, from England to Spain to Portugal to all these other nations were having free labor. This changed as a few years after the Declaration of Independence was signed and America became a nation, Jefferson became president. And in 1807, 3 weeks before Britain abolished the Atlantic slave trade, President Jefferson signed a law prohibiting the importation of slaves into any port or place within the jurisdiction of the United States. This was a good thing and showed that the ideas of Jefferson were changing, and America was changing as well. However, sadly, it took over 60 years until the dream of Jefferson of all men created equal was accomplished and slavery was finally abolished for good. So even though Jefferson owned slaves and also denounced slavery and wished for an America where slavery was not a thing, does that mean that we should eliminate him from our history? No. The man was not perfect, but his ideas were the very framework of our country. So Thomas Jefferson wasn't the only founding father that got his statues taken down by these radicals. As recently, George Washington got his statue taken down as well, as several hundred demonstrators rallied at North Portland's Jefferson High School. A small group gathered outside the downtown Justice Center, and a third group assembled at the statue, which became the latest monument to be torn down by protesters. After the statue was torn down, an American flag was burned on top of him, and it was vandalized just like Jefferson's was. Along with this, a church where Washington regularly attended in Virginia decided to take down a Washington memorial. As a leader of the church said, the move is intended to make the place of worship more welcoming. This is the idea that just like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington owned slaves. But once again, this is not the reason that we are putting this statue up. We put the statues up of George Washington because he was a war hero and a unifier for a young nation. Washington, just like Jefferson, grew up in a society where slavery was just a normal thing, and that doesn't make it okay. I want to make sure that that is very clear. But also, like Jefferson, Washington's mind started to change, as after the Revolutionary War, he began to feel burdened by his personal entanglement with slavery and uneasy about slavery's effect on the nation. Throughout the 1780s and 1790s, Washington stated privately that he no longer wanted to be a slave owner, that he did not want to buy or sell slaves or separate enslaved families, and that he supported a plan for gradual abolition in the United States. He avoided this idea of passing a law to abolish slavery, as it was so ingrained in American culture at the time. So Washington never really touched the idea of slavery when he became president, because he knew that the culture was so ingrained with slavery, and he was scared to. He was scared to even talk about it. So after Washington became president and all this stuff, he demanded in his will that his slaves be set free. And he set free 123 slaves. This change of heart for Washington took a long time in the making, but at the end of his life, he had made up his mind on slavery, that it was wrong. And if he had it his way, he would have dismantled the institution of slavery when he was president, but he knew that it was such a polarizing decree. So once again, Washington was not a perfect person. He owned slaves. But does that mean that we should just erase him from history? No. Washington is the father of our country. And if it wasn't for him, I believe we would still be a colony of the British. George Washington was a war hero that helped create the country that we know and love today. His ideas as president helped the country come together after one of the biggest battles in the young country's history. This idea of tearing down the statues of Washington and Jefferson to me is wrong. And it is something that our society should not find acceptable at all. These statues can be a learning moment for everyone looking at them. You may think, wow, I can't believe they were a slave owner. Then you are able to learn the history and realize that these men had a change of heart. And even the whole nation had a change of heart after the Civil War, which was brutal and terrible, but it was growing pains for America. And after this, the dreams of Washington and Jefferson were fulfilled. And finally, slavery was abolished in America, which is a fantastic thing. So one of these soldiers that fought in the Civil War to protect the rights of every man and keep America together was former President Ulysses S. Grant. He was a Union general. That's right, he fought for the good guys. But guess what? His statue was destroyed too, as protesters in San Francisco on Friday toppled the statue of former President Grant, who led the Union Army during the Civil War, in Golden Gate Park. What was the reason for the taking down of his statue? Well, he inherited a slave from his father-in-law, I believe, and then after a year, he freed the man because he hated the idea of slavery. Seriously, people, this one is the most ridiculous out of them all. If it wasn't for Grant, we could still be split up in two, because he was a general that fought for the good guys. He's the good general. He's a good guy. We should be celebrating him. He hated slavery, and he was one of the best generals, and fought and destroyed the Confederacy. He fought against Robert E. Lee and all the other Confederate generals. And after the Civil War was over, Grant became president of the United States and helped sign the 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans the right to vote. Yes, Grant owned a slave, but throughout his life he hated slavery and wanted the establishment of slavery to be destroyed. This is why he fought for the Union, to end it. So, no, he was not a perfect person, but should his statue be taken down? No. Honestly, I think that Grant needs to be praised more than, say, some of these Confederate statues or some of these Confederate generals that are up all over America. And honestly, you can take down every single Confederate statue, but can we at least save some statues that represent actual American history? Not the history of a rebellious state, but the United States of America? We can see this happening as recently on Capitol Hill, Nancy Pelosi called for 4 pictures of former Confederate speakers of the House to be removed from the Capitol. This is a good thing, as the Capitol is our country, not the Confederacy. Now, this is where things get a little bit messy, because we do need to remember that these generals are a part of our history. They are part of our past. These generals should be taught in our schools. The Confederacy and their ideas should be talked about in schools, because what concerns me is that we will forget the history, and this could lead to us repeating that history of having a splitting off from the United States to having a state where slavery was accepted. So we can learn about these different generals, but that does not mean that we should give them statues or praise them. But what it should be is the opposite, as we learn about their evil ways and how terrible that they were. In school now, we learn about evil people already. For example, we learn about Evil Mustache Man when we talk about World War II. And this reminds me of how after World War II, Germany probably wanted to get rid of everything that was related or anything that involved Evil Mustache Man and move on. But we still know him today. He was not erased from history. And to be honest, I don't think that he should be erased from history, and I don't think anyone should be erased from history. What we can learn from both Evil Mustache Man and the Confederate generals is that their ideology was wrong and their actions were evil. So we can teach people this, and we can say, hey, this is what we don't want to do in our country. These ideologies are evil. We should avoid these different ideologies, and we shouldn't be praising these people. So if a city or a state decides that it is time to take down a statue of a Confederate general, then to me, that is 100% okay. The city can do what it wants. But if we are talking about presidents of the United States, then that is where I personally draw the line. America should know and learn about the history for the better or for the worst. History is history, and the idea of completely erasing someone from history is scary, dangerous, and Orwellian. What do I mean by this? Well, I wanted to end this episode talking about a very important book that all of you should read and all of you should know about, and I recommend it 110%, especially during this time period, and it is called 1984 by George Orwell. This book is about an authoritarian government that takes over the whole society, and in this book, Orwell explains what this society did with statues and history. As he says, every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And the process is continued day by day, minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the state is always right. This is what we don't want America to turn into. America should remember their history for either the better or for the worst. We should learn about these different generals. We should learn about these different presidents, especially the first couple of presidents, including Grant, Jefferson, and Washington. We should learn about their history and what they actually believed in. We should learn the whole story of their ideas and how their ideas can change. And it just goes to show that we can change as people as well. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Dockery Docket. And remember to be like what my mom always says, be good, be kind, be loving. Goodbye.